Hello and welcome to the FasCat Coaching Podcast. This is Coach Andrew, and I'm here with guest coach Sierra Sims. How you doing, Sierra?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Today we're talking about fatigue, and so that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. So I want to start with some definitions. And so my definition of fatigue, in the context of this conversation, is any inhibition of vigor, either physical or psychological. Usually it's both at once, but not always. And to clarify, when I say vigor, I'm referring to the ability or enthusiasm to perform a task. Sarah, what's your definition of fatigue?
So, my definition of fatigue is an amount of energy loss that is either caused by real or perceived difficulty of a task. And so that can be measured via workload or the amount of work put out.
Sweet. Yeah, that's a great definition. Um, and I'm glad you're here because I think we're going to have slightly different takes on some of this stuff. So I think that should just really help our listeners just kind of understand the topic in a more complete way. And so in this episode, I want us to focus less on task specific fatigue or specifically what causes us to slow down within exercise and more about the status of being fatigued post exercise as well as fatigued in a chronic sense. So in other words, there is acute fatigue. If you're going out to do a 20-minute test, which all of our FastCat coached athletes and Coach Cat users will be familiar with. Uh, Fatigue is what makes you stop that 20-minute test. When you're at the end of a 20-minute test, you are too fatigued to continue, and that's obviously going to be part of this discussion. But what I'm more interested in is the status of post-exercise fatigue. So when you wake up that day after your 20-minute test, you are fatigued, right? Um, some athletes who have super fitness or just recover super well will have less fatigue. People who are really busy or maybe didn't sleep or eat enough after that 20-minute test will be more fatigued. And that's what we're going to talk about. Um, this topic is relevant to cyclists and endurance athletes at large because understanding the different types of fatigue that one is experiencing influences the optimal flow of an exercise program and maintains the best combination of load and recovery. So, implicit in what I just said there is that there are different types of fatigue. So, in this podcast, we will primarily discuss the distinction between central and peripheral fatigue, what causes each, and our practical recommendations for navigating each. And so, real quick before we jump in, I have a couple of quick announcements. Um, we want to give a quick plug for our one-on-one coaching as well as our CoachCat subscription, which is our training subscription here at FasCat. Because we give you two ways to ride faster, we have CoachCat for $35 a month, or we have one-on-one coaching with coaches such as Sierra and I, or any of the other FastCat coaches, where you'll get more communication and a higher level of personalization. Whether you're working with us one-on-one or subscribing to CoachCat, we'll share what really works. We'll prevent you from wasting time on what doesn't. Therefore, to get started, every coaching or free app trial begins with a video call or coaching consultation. So, what are you waiting for? The finish line is going to pedal itself. Uh, when we're tackling a big challenge like a gravel race, there's no time to waste. Talk with a coach today or build a custom training plan for free, no credit card required, at fastcatcoaching.com/app. Start today, and you could be talking to us as soon as tomorrow. So, back to the pod. Okay. Let's get into the two types of fatigue I mentioned. So, we have these two categories. We have central and peripheral. So, let's start with talking about what central fatigue is. Do you want to jump into that and tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So central fatigue, that's going to be, the name kind of helps us lead us to where what that is. So it's going to be originating from the brain, and it's where the deficit is coming from kind of like the central signals, and it's kind of the deficit drive of motor cortical output. I think when I was like reviewing everything and like catching up and like remembering physiological stuff, it looks like through like research, it like has kind of like moved into where the brain is where this central fatigue is occurring, whereas it used to kind of be more like the body and like the spinal cord and everything. But that's still like a factor of central fatigue, but it looks like the place of origin is actually the brain. And so through like during exercise, there's an accumulation of a lot of molecules in the brain, and that's kind of the cause of this central fatigue. Is for instance, serotonin, glutamate, and dopamine kind of accumulate in the brain during exercise and through the body, and so it causes this decline in power output, basically, or energy output to the body.
Right. So, just to clarify for our listeners, what Sierra is telling us is that there is a certain neural output required to make force with our muscles, right? So our brain sends signals, through our spinal cord down to the muscles, innervates them, and tells them to produce force. And something that I should start off by saying is that producing more force requires more neural input. So we'll talk about that more later. But yeah, again, just to summarize, this is a limitation of the brain. And so Sierra mentioned exercise there, but central fatigue can also come from other areas. So we'll get into that. But we could experience central fatigue from really cognitively demanding tasks, for example. So you can kind of think about this as anything that requires a ton of focus, whether it's exercise related or non-exercise related, is going to incur central fatigue, right? Do you agree with kind of that summary, Sarah?
Yes, that's perfect.
Sweet. Okay, so the second type of fatigue is peripheral fatigue, and so that's actually a lack of ability for the muscle itself to produce force. So this is sort of, I would almost describe it as being sort of more mechanical in nature. It doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily have to be mechanical; it can sort of be chemical in nature. But that's not as important as just understanding that it's fatigue in the muscles themselves. So these are two separate channels of fatigue, and so we could be like totally topped up on one, and the other could be totally not working. And so, real quick before we move forward, do you want to summarize a little bit of kind of what you learned just in brushing up on this topic about peripheral fatigue?
Yeah, so when I was just like reviewing, the peripheral fatigue is the reduction in the efficacy of the neuromuscular function in terms of metabolic and biochemical uh, processes, basically. Um, and it looked like as if we like looked at the two types of fatigue relative to each other, peripheral fatigue had a stronger correlation with changes in homeostasis. So when the body is experiencing like higher intensity exercise or maybe some type of maybe like elevated stress level in some form, it really looked like the peripheral fatigue kind of took over. And this can also like it was correlating also with onset of blood lactate accumulation. Um, and kind of like central fatigue, where those molecules were the big factor in creating this like fatiguing feeling. Peripheral fatigue like is created through a decline in, in resynthesis of ATP, an inefficiency of contraction coupling, which is just like the the muscle contraction, basically, an inefficiency of being able to do that. Metabolic acidosis via production of potassium and hydrogen ions, and an accumulation of phosphates throughout the body. So it's really interesting how different these two are, but how they are also like connected and separated. And I think like we're gonna like dive into that, but those that's kind of like the main takeaways about peripheral fatigue that I read up on.
Yeah, yeah. So again, so just to kind of summarize for our listeners, what Sarah is saying is that when we experience peripheral fatigue, it, I think to go back to my example of the 20-minute test, at the end of that 20-minute test, you are experiencing that sort of burning sensation in your legs. That is that's primarily cellular acidosis. It's the pH of your cell becomes inhospitable to some of the reactions taking place that are responsible for uh, resynthesizing ATP, which is the energy currency of our cells. That's how we have energy to make these reactions happen that allow us to make force and power, right? So again, inorganic phosphate, lactate is not the cause of fatigue. It's actually helpful. We can reuse it for energy, but it is there. So like anytime your lactate goes higher, I guess the expression you could use is when there's smoke, there's fire.
Mhm.
And I'll also clarify one other point. So Sierra mentioned the onset of blood lactate. Um, you know, we can also kind of talk about this in terms of like FTP or MLSS, anaerobic threshold. This is the point at which lactate is beginning to accumulate faster than we can clear it. And so that can be kind of like a point you think about when you think about peripheral fatigue, right? It's that feeling that your muscles physically can't do it anymore. They have to slow down. And so I guess this all leads us to kind of the interesting question, which is uh, which is the limiter at any given time, or like which is the bigger limiter. And so this probably depends on exercise modality, phenotype, familiarity with that specific exercise modality, and then of course intensity. So that last point, intensity, we've already established that above your lactate threshold, you're going to have to slow down by virtue of primarily peripheral fatigue. Whereas below the lactate threshold, we're more dealing with central fatigue, right? So if you were going to go and do like an 8 hour endurance ride, assuming that you were like relatively prepared for that, there would be no point at which you are experiencing cellular acidosis, right? Like the muscles are not um, like losing their ability to produce force by virtue of accumulating these metabolites that are associated with anaerobic energy, right? It's a different sort of fatigue that we're dealing with there. So, Sierra, before we got on this podcast, we were talking a little bit about when you were in grad school, you all had a discussion about which was the bigger limiter. And so, do you want to kind of tell our listeners like a little bit about like what the prompt was that you got?
Yeah, so I did look more into it too, and I think I was diving also into kind of our in grad school, like, we also discussed, like, the cardiovascular versus, like, the muscular system and what that was, like, a limiter, and so I would think I was, like, aligning it maybe too much with this topic, but it could still be an interesting, like, thought path, but basically, I texted Andrew and I was like, "I think that the discussion in grad school was like, okay, central fatigue, it could possibly be more of a limiter for an athlete that is not like it's not like elite, but it's more like on the edge where they can put in more time on the bike and gain more out of that. So they're able to do like big weeks, like like the big weeks that we see in lifetime, like 30 hours. And that's kind of where their limiter is with fatigue is like the central fatigue because they're like targeting that more. Whereas like peripheral fatigue is what you see in most people where it's like super like cycling is obviously very like muscular, like quad leg focused. And so as an overall population of athletes, like, that's the target that we hit most of the time, like, the fatigue target that we're looking for when we're trying to build, like, fatigue durability or fatigue resistance. Most people are, like, focusing on peripheral, whereas a smaller portion of cyclists are focusing on central, and so that was kind of my thought path. I know, like, Andrew we kind of had I think we were thinking the same thing, but maybe, like, slightly different about it.
Yeah, yeah, but I think the most important thing that you bring up here is that I think athletes negate the influence of central fatigue. At least I think cyclists do, right? I think we're all very focused on peripheral fatigue. We all sort of know that feeling that we talked about, the burning of the legs as the reason why we have to slow down, right? Um, but I think we've also all experienced central fatigue as well, and maybe we wouldn't have called it that. But to sort of summarize like what that might look like, when central fatigue is really high, there are two, I would say, main symptoms, at least like within the context of during exercise. The first is you just kind of want to stop, right? Like you've lost motivation. That lack of motivation or that desire to stop doing whatever intensity you're doing is central fatigue. I would say the other main symptom of central fatigue that everybody's probably experienced is that they just feel like they have to focus much more to hold a given power than they would normally. So this is an example of RPE decoupling from a given effort. So
Mm.
when I work with my one-on-one coach athletes, I like to talk a lot about RPE, and I use that as a measure of kind of what's going on with them, right? And so everybody associates different numbers a little bit with different intensities. But for me, tempo or zone three is like a 6 out of 10, right? That's what I call it. Some athletes are going to call it a five or a four. It just depends. It's a very subjective scale. But regardless, you have this kind of baseline number for how zone three should feel. When you have a tremendous amount of central fatigue, either central fatigue that you've accumulated within the session or central fatigue that you've brought into the session from life stuff, um, what you might experience is that suddenly tempo feels like a 7 or maybe even an 8 out of 10, right? That is central fatigue. It feels harder to do like a given intensity that usually feels easier, right? Do you agree with all that, Sierra?
Oh, I think my Wi-Fi is being weird. Yes. Yes.
Cool. So something that a lot of our listeners might be familiar with is this central governor theory, where the two are like inextricably related, right? So I guess like the question in my mind is, do we assume that both fatigue types are concurrent? And the answer is often yes, but not always. And so what I'm saying here is that when you're becoming fatigued, uh, both types of fatigue are both affecting the performance outcome. So again, to go back to our example, if you're doing a 20-minute test, you're probably, yes, mostly limited by peripheral fatigue, but there is also central fatigue, right? Like your brain has just been putting in a lot of neural output to make that power. And so that system is also going to be fatigued. And so the proportion of each is going to depend on the exercise modality, right? So I think like one of the kind of main examples that I had in mind was like a weightlifting session, right? So I think most of my athletes would not describe their like hypertrophy session, to be specific, as being tremendously fatiguing in a central sense, right? Like you're not, it's not like mentally that challenging, I guess would be another way to put it. But peripherally, it is really challenging, right? Like our legs are going to be sore the next day. And when your legs are sore the next day, what that is peripheral fatigue. We've done muscular damage, perhaps, and so that's something that we have to kind of reckon with. So, um, any thoughts on this idea of like just the feedback loop between the two, or sort of um, experiencing both simultaneously, or whether or not we could have one without the other?
Yeah, I do think that like everyone can kind of relate to this feeling. So like even it's like even somewhat psychological. So like if you're that's why there's like so much like kind of like athletic books about like just like the way of positive thinking. So like if like the psychological way that you approach a workout, if you're like this workout typically like goes poorly and like this is like something that I like haven't looked forward to for like a long time, it's kind of creating this like stress response in your body. And so the central fatigue that you have like going into it might be higher, but in reality the body is like kicking at a high like a high level. And so you can really like approach stuff in a different way and it, like see different outcomes by the way you're thinking. But I would say that as an athlete, like the peripheral fatigue is like a little bit, I would like kind of even relate it to something that's like a little bit more objective where it's like, okay, if my body feels this way, like I know that X, Y, and Z is going to happen. Whereas like central fatigue for me, sometimes it can be a little bit less predictable, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. It's definitely harder to put our finger on this central fatigue, this just sort of um, like mental tiredness is a thing that I think we're less familiar with quantifying, and I think um, not to be critical of uh, America culturally, but I think this sort of like grind culture sort of obscures our willingness to kind of observe or acknowledge central fatigue, right? I think we all have this idea that we should be working super hard, and we shouldn't complain, and we should just kind of do the job, and that's what it is. But all of that comes at a cost. So I think it's really important just to acknowledge here that and I mentioned this earlier, central fatigue doesn't just come from exercising, right? It can come from, like I said, life stress, cognitive tasks. Um, we probably have more central fatigue, or at least um, our recovery from central fatigue is greatly reduced if we haven't slept enough, right? And so I think this brings up like a really kind of interesting point that's sort of relevant to the way that we program and deal with these different streams of fatigue, which is that central and peripheral fatigue have different recovery rates. And so this is really, again, relevant in designing an individualized program, because if one type of fatigue is more present, it's going to affect the type of workouts that we're doing. Um, and so I don't know this for sure, and I tried to do a lot of research on this, but this is um, a little bit of speculation, or I guess maybe more just based on experience. But I would postulate that central fatigue can have a quicker recovery, at least under the right conditions. So if we have like a really mentally challenging workout, and then we get off the bike, we have a good meal, like we watch kind of some cool fun Netflix shows, we're just relaxing with our partner, we sleep really well. The next day, like that can be completely gone, right? Or maybe not completely gone, but like greatly reduced. Like we can feel really refreshed mentally, be super motivated when we wake up and take on another mentally challenging workout the next day. Whereas with peripheral fatigue, if you're not adapted to it and you do a super hard lifting session, or you do a big bout of downhill running, for example, um, I think that the time course for recovery on that is a lot longer, right? Like you're going to be sore for days, and you can't. Of course, those same things like having a relaxing evening, sleeping really well, having good nutrition are going to help, but I think it's the timeline is a little bit less flexible. Do you have any experience with this, Sarah? Do you kind of agree with my kind of analysis or theory on the topic?
Yeah, I agree with your theory for sure. It's kind of, I wish that it would be easier to find like, I guess it would be kind of hard to measure this, but I think that like the thought path and the hypothesis makes sense with it, you know, because it's like kind of what I was saying. Like it seems like peripheral is like it's like more objective, so it's like we experience that and we're able to like tell that that takes a certain amount of time to recover. Whereas central, you're really able to like do the right things basically. And that's why I think we also as like coaches there's like so much recovery information that we give out, because that is like really helping the central fatigue kind of day to day with like training and structure, basically.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and so I think this is a good time to bring up, what I thought was a pretty interesting study, and this is sort of like a reflection on some of the acute effects of central fatigue. And I think we'll give our listeners some really kind of concrete examples of how central fatigue is affecting their workouts. So in the study I was reading, they had two groups. They had a study group where prior to doing a time to exhaustion test, which is just riding at some fixed intensity until you can't any longer, they had participants do some really cognitively demanding task. So I don't remember exactly what it was, but an example of this could be something like words on a screen would pop up, and
Mm.
maybe the word would say green, but the text would be in red. Like, this is super hard for our brain to deal with, or it could be, you know, complex math or something like that. Like anything that just really requires your focus. And then in the the control group, and this goes back to my example of like a relaxing evening, they just had them watch like a fun TV show for the same amount of time. And unsurprisingly, the group that did the cognitively demanding task prior to their TTE test uh, had a much shorter time to exhaustion, whereas the group that did watch some relaxing TV show did better, and they could go longer. Right? They just had more mental juice. And so I think this is just super relevant to all of us, right? And like one of the implications for the way that we set up our training day is, if you have like a really cognitively demanding thing to do and you also have a hard workout, maybe you do the workout first, right? Because you're going to do better. Um, and maybe this isn't possible and we just kind of have to deal with it, and it is what it is. But do you have any kind of thoughts or sort of practical recommendations for our listeners on how to deal with this sort of scenario?
Yeah, so I think that sometimes it is like very much like kind of set in schedule. So like for me as like a coach where if I ride in the middle of the day, usually like the quality of work is better in the beginning of the day. So it's just like prior to my workout, I'm less like brain fried. If it's like a type of like a type of workout that requires a lot of like thinking and thought and energy output. I do actually have had read that study, and I remember thinking, I'm like, oh, I wonder if like driving like a long time to like a race in the morning, like that's like causing me to have fatigue. And so much like there's so much like placebo effect and everything, so it's always hard to like judge yourself. But I've never noticed like if I drive for hours and then race. Like, I don't think it ever causes, like, a great enough fatigue to where I'm like, I shouldn't do that." Um, but I do think it's more, like, chronic. So, like, if I had, like, multiple weeks in a row of, like, a lot of, like, stress and fatigue and then, like, drove to the race, I do think that that would be, like, more obvious that that, like, affected me negatively. But I think if I was, like, keeping up with my, like, central fatigue and, like, constantly making sure that it didn't, like, chronically build, kind of like how, like, sleep debt builds, like, I feel like the chronic fatigue does, um, or the central fatigue does, uh, I think that, like, the driving to, like, a race doesn't matter. That's, like, a thought that I've, like, really thought about, like, driving to races, like, in the morning and, like, wondering if that, like, negatively affects me, but I feel like it doesn't unless, like I'm saying.
Yeah, I absolutely love this point because it's relevant to me. It's relevant to all of our listeners who do bike racing. Um, and I think it just depends on the individual, depends on the drive. And so for me, thinking about that same question, really what it comes down to is one, how long the drive is, two, how scary the drive is. So if it's like a super twisty mountain road, that's more cognitively demanding for me than if it's just like a super straight highway cruise. And then the big factor in my personal experience is whether or not I'm late. If
Mm,
I'm late, my stress goes through the roof, and then I'm also going to drive faster because I want to get there on time. And driving fast is really cognitively demanding for me because when you're driving faster, you have less time, you have to be more focused. You're worried about getting pulled over, you're worried about getting to the race on time. And so I think the point is that like anything that feels stressful to you requires a mental marble. And sure, like I think to your point, Sierra, it's probably not a huge influence. Like maybe that is a reduction in TTE of 1%, right? But if we want to show up to the race with 100% of our mental marbles intact and have the longest TTE possible, we want to delay that central fatigue as long as possible. Yeah, maybe the recommendation is that like you should show up at the race, or I'm sorry, show up at the race the night before, right? But that can also come at a cost. So you kind of just have to do some calculations here. I say that comes at a cost because I like sleeping in my own bed, right? Like that's relaxing for me. And sometimes sleeping in a hotel room is not as nice. But I think another way to frame this is um, to try and reduce the number of decisions that you have to make before a hard training ride or before a race. And the practical implication of this is one having reps in the tank of going to races, knowing what to do, knowing, you know, what your warm up is going to be like, where you're going to warm up, what you're going to wear. I try and make as many of these decisions the day before as I can. And this is a big reason why we suggest to our athletes to do B races. Because the first time you go to a big race, um, yeah, you have to make a lot of decisions, and decisions are fatiguing in a mental sense. And so yeah, like we want to reduce stress in decision making um, all around our uh, all around our training and racing. And this is, not to give a shameless plug, but this is also a good reason to be coached, right? Because we as coaches, um, we can make a lot of decisions for you. We can tell you how to warm up. We can help you decide what to wear, what tires to run. We can tell you what workout to do. Deciding what workout to do could be like really fatiguing, you know? And so, taking some of those decisions out of the picture is going to just leave you with more mental juice, right? Um, so, so yeah, I think those are all factors. Um, Something I want to move on to is additional sources of fatigue. Um, and so, these are primarily like things that aren't um, your primary sport. These are like additional things, or just like additional aspects that could lead to fatigue, either central or peripheral. And so I have just a short list here. And so the first is sauna or heat training. Um, that is an additional source of fatigue that sort of has to be accounted for. And I don't know which category we put that in, like whether that's central or peripheral. There's obviously not, like if you're doing passive heat, there's no contraction happening. So I assume it's kind of more central in nature. But that is something that I think is going to influence the nervous system. So just kind of talking through it out loud, I think that would fall into the category of central fatigue, right? And again, it's heat training protocols are tricky because like you kind of mentioned before about central fatigue at large, it's harder to quantify, right? Another one would be hypoxia or being at altitude. And so I would sort of conjecture that there's less peripheral fatigue at the same relative intensity in this setting because you're doing less absolute power. So like when you're at altitude, like you're gonna be freaking tired. You are definitely gonna be fatigued after some number of days there. But the fatigue is probably more central in nature than it is peripheral. Another big one, and we'll get more into this, I think, down the road in this podcast, is metabolic stress, right? So if you're constantly at a caloric deficit, this is super stressful for your body. And this one is probably both central and peripheral. It's peripheral in that if you are in a caloric deficit, you might have less glycogen available, less substrate available for the muscles, and so that's peripheral in nature. But it's certainly both. It's causing your nervous system stress as well. We've already talked about high cognitive load tasks, and we've already talked a little bit about resistance training. But anything you'd add to this list of just interesting other pieces of the fatigue puzzle within the context of an athlete's life?
I don't think so. You really hit the main ones. I think the metabolic one's really an interesting one. I think also like one that we focus on a lot, just with like when you like reference fueling. I think that that's like an interesting one to keep in mind. But like they all are like hypoxia and sauna. Just like with races coming up, like knowing like what that fatigue is going to feel like and how it's going to vary, um, and like relating that between them. But yeah, those are like pretty much hitting all the main ones right there.
Yeah, and with the metabolic thing, I mean, that kind of almost like leads us in the direction of talking a little bit, very briefly, about chronic fatigue, right? Or like red S. Some of these things are kind of associated with like overtraining or burnout, and that's a topic I've covered in previous podcast episodes. So if people are more interested in that,
Hmm.
they should go back and listen to those. But there's this idea um, that overtraining is almost not even possible without like an energy deficit. So like the two are like really very pretty linked. It's something that's still being studied because it's a complex and multifactorial concept. Um, but yeah, I mean, not getting enough calories is going to just be tremendously stressful on you. So I think that's kind of one of the important things to bear in mind. Um, yeah. So moving on, the next thing I just wanted to kind of touch on real quick are different exercise modalities, and how they're fatiguing. And so we can kind of like talk about this in addition to kind of talking about the fatigue associated with different intensities of cycling. But I think kind of the two are sort of one and the same. And there's just I think, some interesting takeaways from this. So I have a short list here. We have concentric only exercises. So cycling is the example of this. um and yeah, I would say like generally, unless you're doing something super novel or something like super intense, there is going to be less, and this is a comparative thing, not an absolute thing. There's going to be less peripheral fatigue than eccentric exercises, right? And so the example of this eccentric exercise is obviously resistance training. If you're doing traditional resistance training, but I think the bigger or the maybe more interesting example is running, right? So running, I think in general involves a lot more peripheral fatigue than does cycling, right? So um, you're just kind of getting beat up. Your muscles are breaking down to a higher degree, and so I think that the two sports are sort of different in that regard, and I think that's interesting. And then the third thing I have on the list, and I'm sure there's more, and maybe you have some additional ideas, Sierra, but is like ballistic or like plyometric exercises, in sort of what fatigue is associated with those. Um, they're definitely both. I think it depends on the style, but I really think of plyometric training as being centrally fatiguing, right? Because you have to just be so coordinated and so explosive. I think like moving really fast like that just requires like a ton of neural input. So,
Mhm.
any experience or just kind of thoughts on the above?
The one thought I thought of just now is like how it'd be interesting if they've done like triathlon research on this all because I feel like they would have like a really interesting dynamic of like central versus peripheral fatigue since they're like doing, like so they're like elite level basically in three sports, then like doing running on top of like a ton of cycling. So um yeah, I think that would be like a thought path that I had just now. But um yeah, that was really
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny you bring that up. because I did actually read a study on triathletes. It wasn't really about being a triathlete and doing different exercise modalities at once. It was actually about whether or not variable powered cycling efforts were more fatiguing than steady efforts. And so this is kind of like a
Mm,
cool practical discussion for our listeners. So in this study, both groups did the same average power output, right? So let's say it was 300 watts for 30 minutes. One group varied their power every few minutes by 15%. The other group just rode steady at the same average power. Um, and what they found was that there was no difference in the fatigue, either like peripheral or central. Um, and so obviously, what does that sound like? That sounds like over unders, right? And so I I think I have two thoughts on that, or two sort of rebuttals, and they did talk about this a little bit in the discussion, which was a 15% variation in power is pretty small, right? So that's like a pretty mild over under. So that would be like we call them crisscross intervals here at FasCat. That would be like tempo threshold or
right.
like tempo low VO2, right? Yeah, that's not like really that much more fatiguing than doing like just a steady threshold interval. I do, however, think it would be different if it were uh, like 30/30s is another example of this, where maybe you average threshold for 10, 15, 20 minutes. Um, but it's going to be way more fatiguing just because you're getting into such large motor units, which are more fatigable. You're having to be like really explosive. It's requiring more neural input to do those really high power outputs. So I think that's a factor. But I think the other factor, at least in the discussion of like, should I do over unders or steady efforts, is like which is mentally easier for you. I think that's like a real factor, right? And this is maybe dependent on phenotype, but like some people are just get really mentally exhausted by holding steady power, right? Like if they had to do 2 by 20 threshold, that would just totally exhaust them. Whereas maybe doing an over under effort would sort of break it up mentally. And that's totally valid. Like this doesn't have to be something that we overthink in terms of like the physiology or psychophysiology of it all. Any thoughts on that? Do you have a preference, Sarah, between or I guess like maybe the better question for you is like when you prescribe workouts to your athletes, do you think of like a steady interval or an over under session being like more fatiguing or less fatiguing?
Ooh, that's a good question. Like what I think I think what I don't really feel like the longer intervals, like I visualize that as being more fatiguing. Um, but I think that when I think that way, I make it where, okay, we have that in our workout plan usually, but it's not like overloaded or anything, but it's something that is targeted to like implement like fatigue resistance or like just basically like not even fully fatigue resistance, but like a part of like, okay, we need to like be able to do this basically if it's like if it's like, a person that
Totally.
is needing it. Um but I do think like as like a personal experience of like in the beginning of the year needing to like train kind of like higher end and then like switching over into like longer intervals, the like the the mental fatigue I have of like doing like high intensity at some point needs to be like counterbalanced by like long like tempo pieces basically. And so I think that as like a coach that's like kind of you're like playing with asking the athlete like subjectively how it's going, because I think a lot of the time people will tell you like this isn't this is like really tough and like I'd rather do something else, and then usually you can find something else to do that will hit the right thing. So
Totally.
that's kind of what I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and again, it's all very personalized, and it depends on your subjective experience and your preferences, whether those are based off of physiology or psychology. I don't think it matters. Both are relevant. Um, but to touch on one last point about uh, the triathlete example, something that I thought was pretty interesting that I read in some research earlier was that let's say somebody swims in the morning and then they bike in the afternoon, right? And so I don't know much about swimming. So all the swimmers out there and triathletes, like, please just excuse my ignorance. But let's just for a second assume that the type of swimming that you're doing is primarily fatiguing for the upper body, right? I think that is that like a fair assumption about swimming that it's like more kind of upper body oriented.
Yeah, I feel like you can also make it that way because you can swim with, like, the paddles, so
Yeah.
you could make it
I
like
guess another example would be like rock climbing or doing like dumbbell curls.
Yeah, I feel
But
like for you, it's like
um
rock climbing, but I've definitely it's like you can make a swimming workout, like, very upper body focused, so I think that people will relate to that.
okay, cool. So what I'm trying to set up here is that if you swam in the afternoon, then you're gonna bike later in the day, you have peripheral fatigue in the upper body from that swim. Let's say you're doing like a threshold kind of oriented or like a max swim effort. You know, you have all those metabolites kind of building up in your upper body. That probably is not going to affect your legs. So your legs going to that session do not have peripheral fatigue, right? So like you're kind of at a good baseline to do your bike workout from a peripheral perspective, but you are, however, bringing central fatigue in from that previous swim workout. If it was the type of swim workout that would have central fatigue associated with it. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that I do think we have to be careful with our cross training. You know, we can't just assume like, okay, I'm going to do bicep curls in the morning because that's not going to affect my bike workout. Bicep curls is maybe like a bad example, but like I guess swimming would be the better one. But it probably is still going to have some effect if the type of swim that you're going to do is going to involve some central fatigue. So
Yeah.
I I think that's just like a thing to keep in mind. Um, but anyway, kind of to circle back to just cycling specifically, something that I wanted to kind of talk about was um, different intensities and how the fatigue curves work for each of those with both types of our fatigue here. And so just to simplify the conversation, we're going to separate intensities into uh, three zones. So this is sort of like the way that a lot of the science talks about intensities. So zone 1 would be like everything below zone 2. Zone 2 would be from the top of zone 2 to your lactate threshold, and zone 3 would be everything above, right? So you could describe it as like moderate, heavy, and severe domains. And so I just made some notes here about kind of what I found in the research. And so for zone 1, again, this is like just everything below zone 2. And it says, in no major changes in the concentration of exercise induced metabolites, i.e., lactate, in muscle and blood compared to baseline, um, i.e., there was no peripheral fatigue because we weren't accumulating any of those metabolites that would cause like muscular perturbances. Um, and then it goes on to say, therefore, while neuromuscular fatigue is modest or absent in the moderate intensity domain, it becomes increasingly apparent with exercise in the heavy and severe intensity domains. So, yeah, there is a different type of fatigue cost for different intensities, and this should be obvious, but I think it's just something that's really important for people to keep in mind, right? Because it's going to affect how we stack our workouts. And so you can tell me if you agree with this, Sierra. But when I think about um, an athlete's week, I'm not just thinking about what ingredients they need from like an adaptive signaling perspective or like an energy systems perspective, but I'm thinking about like what are they going to be ready for, right? Like if they do uh like a VO2 session on Tuesday, on Wednesday, like maybe they want something that's going to be more associated with like the opposite type of fatigue, right? Is that how you think about it as well? Is my point being kind of made here? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's, like, the, like, second ingredient that we do. I feel like it's like, okay, what does someone need? And then, how do I, like, implement that in correctly to where they, like, are given, like, the best outcome or, like, the best possible outcome. So, That is, like I do think it's, like, the most challenging though, because you have to be, like, really in tune with, like, what's going on, and so, like, if it's someone that for instance, there's a lot of, like, parents where they have, like, the weekend is, like, the most stressful because they're, like, going to sporting events or and they're, like, having to work out in the morning or later in the day, and, sometimes, like, you would like, they need, like, time like, later in the week is better because 'cause they're still, like, recovering from, like, the overload of the weekend or, like, um so it's not always, like, the one size fits all, but it's, like, also figuring out, like what you're saying, like, how this person will react because it could be where they, like, 2 days of the week have to be back to back, and, like, those are gonna be just, like, very, like, fatiguing, but then, like, it's followed by something that's, like, a big offload, so it's, like, the constant just, like, fatigue dependence, like plan. So, I think that like, what you're saying is
Yeah,
right online.
totally. Yeah, yeah, and so, like, we as coaches are always trying to balance that and, like, give athletes the thing that they're gonna be most successful at, I guess is another way to put it, right? So we're, like, always trying to set you up for a home run, and that's not to say that we're not gonna make you do training that's challenging for you, because sometimes that's just what you need to do, and sometimes you need to do training when you're fatigued or, like, when you're carrying a certain type of fatigue, but, we do try and be kind, and we do try and keep everything in balance. Um, but one other kind of point while we're on the topic of like different intensities that I kind of came across in the research was repeated sprint training. I thought was kind of an interesting uh, style of workout in terms of what's getting fatigued in that setting. And so let's say you were going to do a workout where you did 10 seconds max sprints and then you had just total recovery, let's say like 6 7 minutes between each effort. um, when they studied this in the paper that I read, they explained that the fatigue initially is all peripheral, and then it becomes central with an increasing number of reps. So like once you get to the sixth, seventh, eighth rep, like mentally you're just exhausted from having to innervate all those large motor units and be super coordinated. So I thought that that was kind of an interesting thing where it was both, and that also like the curve flipped as the session went on in terms of what type of fatigue you were accumulating more. But another kind of interesting point that I considered or kind of thought about was that I think this is an example of an area where an athlete's phenotype probably has a big effect on like the type of fatigue that they experience. And so, within the context of doing like a repeated sprint session, an athlete with a lower P max, let's say sub 1000 watts, is just going to incur less fatigue from that session than somebody with a P max that's double that, right? And so I think like different types of workouts can be more or less fatiguing for different types of athletes. And so I think that again goes into the personalization bucket, and is a big part of kind of the way that we look at an individual's training program. So uh, I don't know if this is your experience or not, Sarah, but like I think like a sprint type session or an anaerobic session, let's say like 1 minute efforts, is going to be more fatiguing for a more sprint type or fast twitch dominant athlete. Whereas, for like more of like a TT type session, like a long duration, high power, like a threshold workout, that would probably be, I guess, by that logic, maybe easier for the sprint type athlete, like the more fast twitch dominant person, just because maybe they can't go as long or dig as deep. Has that been your experience as well, or does that relationship not hold for kind of more of the slow twitcher?
No, I think that what you're saying, it holds for at least across the board, kind of like thought path, definitely. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So in other words, I guess what I'm saying here is the thing that you're good at is actually oftentimes harder. However, I think a relevant factor in that is kind of motivation and fear of a workout. I think can have a big effect, right? So if I'm more of a sprint type athlete, I might be really scared of the more kind of steady state style intervals. So that's probably a factor as well. Um, But yeah, the next thing I want to kind of roll into, and this is going to be super practical for our listeners, is if you have, let's say, a lot of peripheral fatigue and you're going into a workout tomorrow, um, what are some of the things that we can do to improve the outcome? And so, what I'm thinking about here specifically is torque and how torque is going to be related to our performance when fatigued. And and so there was a really interesting paper by some of my kind of favorite researchers, Andy Jones and Mark Burnley. They're really they're kind of stalwarts of the exercise science community. Um, and so they explained that critical torque represents a critical threshold for neuromuscular fatigue development. And so critical torque is going to be the torque equivalent of critical power. And so um, it's the amount of torque above which you're going to fatigue much more quickly and below which you can kind of sustain, pseudo indefinitely. And so what I'm getting at here, if we've kind of established this relationship between like going above or staying below a critical torque, is that one way that you could modify your workouts to still be successful when you have a lot of peripheral fatigue is to um, increase the RPMs, right? So we're like lessening the burden on our muscles or our large motor units, which are presumably fatigued in this context. Is that something that you've used with any of your athletes or experimented with yourself? Maybe even something that you just kind of do intuitively?
Yeah, I think I do this so much. Actually, I've had multiple athletes like ask me why we work so much with cadence, but um and I like dive into kind of this like background a little bit and just talking more about like aerobic focus versus like muscular focus. And um I think it's also just like important for in most people when they're like preparing for a race, like you don't want them just like grinding. And I've seen that before where or they're like new to cycling and they're like their cadence is lower anyways. And so I think that it's something that I like hit on with everybody when I take any athlete on, and then it like kind of like their response to it like determines like how often we utilize it. But I think I use it across the board, I would say, to a point where people like are like, why are we doing this? But I think it's really important.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure everybody's heard the expression "spin to win,"
Mhm.
right? And I don't know if whoever coined that phrase had this kind of phenomena in mind when they said that, but I do think it holds true that if you can keep the torque relatively low, your legs are going to stay fresh. You're going to be able to stave off that peripheral fatigue, and that's going to be a good thing, right? I think the flip side of this, and this is a big part of why a lot of coaches prescribe kind of like high RPM training, is that if you're not coordinated at high RPMs, um, that's going to be centrally fatiguing, right? So then we kind of like trade one for the other, and we don't want that. Like if you want to kind of avoid both streams of fatigue, then you need to practice doing high RPMs. And so there are neuromuscular adaptations to any sort of new task, especially those that involve a lot of coordination. Um, and so this works with strength training, but it also works with doing kind of higher RPMs. So we have to adapt to that beforehand, and so it's a good thing to practice. Um, but I'm glad that that's a tool that we both like. So unfortunately, we're running out of time here. We've covered a lot, although we have way more that I would love to talk about. So maybe that'll be another episode. Um, but before we go, I wanted to see if you had any like real practical recommendations just kind of surrounding all of this. I know that that's very open-ended, but whatever you want to tell our listeners.
Oh man. Okay, so I don't know if you wanted to talk about adjusting warm up time, and I'm assuming you had a thought about this. But this is I think warm up time is something for me like personally this year where that's like been the biggest like learning thing as like an athlete. So like coming into more stuff in the beginning of the year with just like all of this fatigue and like having to figure out the best warm up. And at first I was like, maybe I'm just like getting old, but I think it's really just, like, the fatigue that I brought into stuff, and, like, having if I have, like, it's more just, like it really came off as just, like, overall fatigue and, like, the longer warm up was needed to, like, really it seemed like get the body going, and I just, like, equated it to, like, the systems, like, needing a lot of more time to, like, basically, like, flush and, like, get everything loaded and ready. And then, like, on top of that, metabolically, only being able to warm up for a long time if I was, like, fueled correctly. So, like, nutrition on top of that, has been, like, something really important, and I think that if you're able to, like for me, a lot of it's just, like, come back to nutrition, like, if you're able to, like, fuel properly and hit like, you could hit everything well, but if you're able to fuel properly, then you can kind of go into a race with different levels of fatigue and then kind of, like, adjust how you approach a race, like, according to that, but you can't there's a lot less that you can do before a race if you're, like, nutritionally at a deficit. That's kind of, like, the biggest recommendation I have with fatigue is that it just, like, depends on so much more than training. It's a lot of, like, how you treat your body with fuel, like, hydration, and then just, like, sleep. So, there's, like, more to cycling than just riding your bike for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I absolutely love that point, Sierra. For me, how long it's taking out an athlete to feel good within the context of a workout or like within the context of how long they need to warm up for is like a major marker of fatigue for me. So, like all of these things that we're talking about here are like really obvious when they're extreme. Like when you've just lifted for the first time of the year and your legs are totally smoked, like nobody is questioning what's going on there. Like you know exactly what the cause was, you know exactly what's happening. Similarly, when you're like totally mentally smoked, like you're not motivated, you're exhausted, you just don't have that will. That's also super obvious. But I think most athletes are going to live somewhere in like shades of gray between these things. And like we said earlier, these things are hard to quantify, right? So I think the really interesting or nuanced situations are where you have low levels of one or the other. And I think warm up time is actually like a really good quantifiable way of measuring fatigue. So if it normally takes you only 15 minutes to feel really good, um, and it's taking you 25 minutes for your legs to come around, that's a sign that you're fatigued and you probably need some more rest, right? Um, and we as coaches can be sort of prescriptive around this, so we can anticipate these sorts of things. If you have a B or a C race coming up, we're not tapering. You did hard intervals during the week, and then you're racing on the weekend. We're going to prescribe a longer warm up because that's what you're going to need to feel good. Um, the last thing that I'll mention before we go here, because it's crazy that we haven't talked about it yet, is HRV,
Oh, yeah.
right? So we obviously utilize HRV measurements in our app, and it's I would say like that is a good measure of your central fatigue, right? So that is like the one way that we can quantify it. You can be super super stressed and sleep bad, even in absence of hard exercise, and have like a low HRV. So I think something that would be like really interesting for all athletes to do is measure their HRV, not just like during the season, but maybe in their off season when they take a break and they're not riding, and see how life events affect HRV and not just how like a super intense training session affects it. And I think that would help to color how life stress impacts us in terms of our central nervous system. So, yeah, with that, thank you so much, Coach Sierra, for coming on. If any of the listeners want to hire Coach Sierra or myself, head over to fastcatcoaching.com. If you just want to sign up for a free trial or use the app, that's also fantastic. And, as I mentioned at the top, you are entitled to a free coaching consultation as well with one of us real live coaches. So, you could talk to us and utilize us in that sense as well. So, um, thank you, and that's it.
Thanks, Andrew. It was awesome.
Thanks, Sierra.